Reporting, and joining us now is Blaise Misztal. He is the acting director of the Foreign Policy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Blaise, good to see you. So it seems to me,
good afternoon,
and maybe you can make more sense of this. I'm sure you can. That you have two different kind of anti-Erdogan movements, anti-government movements going on right now. Certainly the protest over Gezi Park and the development there, and then the protest over the growing government corruption scandal. Are these two movements merging into one sort of large anti-government, throw the bums out movement in Turkey?
Not yet. You're right
Okay.
that there's really two issues here. But one is really a question of elite dissent against Erdogan's rule, and that's really within the ruling AK party. So the corruption scandal that we've seen has really been an attempt by people within his own governing coalition to discredit him. And then there's the popular movement, which dates back, as you said, to the Gezi Park protests. But the one thing tying them all together is the Prime Minister Erdoğan and his heavy-handed response and his attempt to grab ever more power. When we do see the dissent from both sides merge together, then there might be a good chance of actually seeing him lose his position.
So wait a minute. So Blaise, at the moment, since we don't have that merging, at the moment is the most serious threat to Erdogan at the moment the dissension, dissatisfaction, the ruptures, fissures within his own party?
I think in the long term it is, because you have people who have levers of power. They have the ability to start investigations, as we've seen. They have information that they've been leaking about his alleged corruption, which involves tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And they're the ones who really seem intent on pushing him out, as opposed to these protests, which die down, start back up again, but don't have a discrete political alternative that they're pushing.
And so Turks are going to the ballot box, to elections at the end of this month. We've been talking about the infighting within his party, but when we're talking about polls here, the people get a voice in all of this. It starts at the end of the month. Will this vote, I know we're talking about local elections, will it tell us anything about public opinion surrounding this government and the Prime Minister?
It could, but only if we see the ruling AK party really receive a much lower percentage of the vote than is expected. But because Prime Minister Erdoğan isn't on the ballot, this won't really be a referendum on him or his rule.
So ultimately speaking, you think it's the long-term impact of what's happening inside the party that pose the greatest threat? When will that process begin to show itself? I know there are a series of elections coming up.
That's right. And I think it's going to start after these local elections. I think after the elections, Prime Minister Erdoğan will start positioning himself first for presidential elections in August, that he might run for president, or perhaps parliamentary elections if he decides to stay on as Prime Minister next year. And what we're likely to see is him cracking down even more. He doesn't seem to like to deal with dissent. He doesn't like to deal with protesters. He seems to crack down. And so the question is he going to be more like Vladimir Putin and be able to handle the dissent and stay in power, or more like Viktor Yanukovych and really get forced out by this confluence of political problems?
So let's stay on that point for one more question, Blaise. I think you're onto something that's interesting to me. As you know, there's been this passage of bills, right, restricting the internet, tracking users, and calling these most recent protests undemocratic, right? Is this a way to try to cap this growing movement, to try to clip it at the knees here? But in doing so, is he confirming the view of many that he is becoming this sort of rising authoritarian?
That's right, and that is the fear that I think many Turks have, and many people in the European Union and the United States that are watching this have. It's one thing to deny allegations of corruption. Most Turks either don't believe them, or those that believe them say, so what, everyone's corrupt. But it's really the crackdown. It was the crackdown on protesters that started the big protests last summer. It's the crackdown now on social media, on people who are attempting to attend the funeral of the boy who was killed. It's that crackdown that might really threaten him in the end.
Blaise, appreciate your time. Blaise Misztal, he is the acting director of the Foreign Policy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Joining us from Washington, D.C. Blaise, appreciate it. Thank you. In Libya, the government says the NATO